we're going to think about two different examples of diversity and the roots of the diversity in those countries today. The first example is Singapore. This is a very interesting example of a multicultural society. It is in fact a very historic port town. It's been really important as a port, as a meeting point in Asia for many, many hundreds of years. It's a small island, and it's one of the smallest island countries in the world. It's interesting because it's a former British colony, so it was in fact part of the British Empire, and a really, really important part of the British Empire too, because as we said, it was a port, so in terms of transportation, exports and imports, this port was very, very important. It's also really attached to the south of Malaysia, so it's very similar in some respects to Malaysia, but also very distinct and very different. Nowadays, there is a Chinese majority in Singapore, so we have seen a lot of immigration from China, from many different regions of China too. There are many, many different dialects of Chinese spoken in Singapore, and you can see the influence, like we can see in the image with the Chinese lanterns, of this mixture of cultures, so kind of very British architecture in the background, and a very symbolic image of the Chinese lanterns in the foreground. So apart from the Chinese majority, we also have a big Indian and Malaysian community in Singapore, which means that there are now 4 official languages in the country. We can see in the sign that there are 4 languages. We have English as the first one, then we have Mandarin, then we have Malay, and then we have Tamil. So these 4 official languages are used by many, many people. Most people are multilingual in Singapore, in fact. Most people speak at least 2 of these different languages. And perhaps also another dialect of Chinese, for example, or another Indian language too. So apart from the Indian and Malaysian communities, we also have a big group of immigrants that have come from Europe to work in Singapore too, as it's a very important centre for businesses in Asia. An interesting thing in terms of language in Singapore that we also have is Singlish, which, as you might imagine, is like a dialect of English. So it's English, but with lots of influence from Mandarin, with different pronunciations, with different vocabulary, and also with different grammatical structures. So this would be like the main lingua franca between people living in Singapore. So apart from these 4 official languages, there are at least 21 other languages spoken on the island, although I imagine that is actually a much bigger number than the ones found in the census reports. Another example, which is very relevant for us, is Mexico. So Mexico is actually home to thousands of different indigenous cultures and over 60 indigenous languages, with hundreds of dialects and variants. So even before the arrival of the Spanish and other European groups in Mexico, there were thousands of different cultures living in this region. And there had been different empires throughout history, the Aztec Empire, for example, the Mayan Empire. So in some ways, these different cultures, although they were very separate, have been connected for many, many hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we obviously see in the 1500s the arrival of Spanish and European settlers. So this brought to Mexico, well, a very big mixture of cultures. So we see the Spanish colonizing Mexico and creating New Spain. We also see immigrants from England, from Italy, and from France. So there's also been this big mixture of European cultures here too. There have been a lot of Asian immigrants, so immigration from Japan and China has also been increasing in the last century too. Also people from Lebanon, there's a very big Lebanese community in Mexico too. So at the moment, Mexico has a very different type of cultural diversity to the ones we might see in Europe or even the United States. There's a huge mixture of European, indigenous and other cultures that are present in the country. One other group that is on our PowerPoint is the Afro-Mexican communities. This is a group that has only recently been recognized by Mexico in the census and in the documents of the country. But the Afro-Mexican groups are mostly descendants of former slaves who either had already been brought to Mexico or who escaped from other parts of the Caribbean and Central America to live in Mexico. There are huge Afro-Mexican communities in Veracruz and also in Oaxaca and Guerrero.